Well, now that we've got a new Superman movie in theaters, I was feeling nostalgic and thought I would look back on the first ever Superman movie that I ever saw in theaters. And regardless of what you think about this new Superman, this one is not as good. Superman Returns. Now, Superman Returns came out in 2006 and is a continuation of sorts of the old Superman series starring Christopher Reeve, and those movies really did not end well with Superman 4, and even Superman 3 wasn't that great. I will still stand by the fact that the first Superman the movie, is legitimately good. The second one is a bit messier, but it's still perfectly enjoyable in that campy 80s comic book movie kind of way. But the other two are just falling apart at the seams. And this movie was a legitimate attempt to bring back interest in Superman. They brought on Bryan Singer to direct, who had just struck comic book gold with his first two X-Men movies, so they thought naturally he'd be a good fit for this Superman reboot. And what Bryan Singer does here is basically doing the exact same thing he did in X-Men Days of Future Past. He basically wiped the slate clean. He said the first two movies are canon, everything else is scrapped. Now we're picking up a couple years after Superman 2, and we're going to continue the franchise from here. So this movie is still canon with the Reeve films, but in a very loose sense, and 3 and 4 are just better off not asking too many questions about. And watching this movie again, I wanted to look at it with fresh eyes. It's been almost 20 years since it came out, and I remember when I saw it in theaters, I was dazzled by all the Superman things. I thought it was really cool. But, you know, superhero movies have come a long way since 2006. We've seen a lot more crazy comic book concepts brought to the big screen, and I was afraid that this movie would really lose a lot of its luster. And while I was never a huge fan of this movie, even when it came out, I thought some of the lead performances were good, and I felt like that plus the nostalgic connection to the Christopher Reeve movies would carry me through this movie upon rewatch, and it really doesn't. This movie has a lot of problems, and I'm not the first person to say that. I know this is not a very beloved superhero movie, but I was really trying to find something in it to connect to, something to really get invested in, and the movie just makes it really hard to do that. But let's start at the beginning. So opening up here, we have this text that tells us a lot of what we already know about Superman's origin and all that, and then it tells us that Superman had left Earth because some astronomers have discovered some Kryptonian debris floating out in space, a chunk of Krypton out there somewhere that might have some life or some answers to Superman's past. So he goes on a mission, and now 5 years later he returns and he finds that life isn't really how he left it. People have moved on. Lois Lane, here played by Kate Bosworth, is now married. She's married the nephew of her boss, Perry White. He's an assistant editor at the Daily Planet, and they have a kid who's about 5 years old, so Superman hasn't met him yet. But she's still Lois Lane as you know her. She's this journalist, and she's doing a lot of the same things that Margot Kidder was doing, except I really can't get behind Kate Bosworth as Lois Lane. She just seems a bit too young, a bit too naive in her face and her performance. The lines that she's given actually aren't that bad. It's got kind of a cynical edge to it, but for whatever reason, this actress doesn't give that kind of world-weary, cynical energy that Margot Kidder did, which was such a crucial thing to get right with Lois Lane. If you're gonna have a good Lois Lane, she needs to have that fast-talking, quick wit and cynical edge to her, because she needs to contrast against Superman, who's this big blue Boy Scout, truth, justice, and the American way, and to have them be complete opposites is fantastic. It worked really well in pretty much every version of Superman out there that has done this formula, whether it's the animated series, the original Superman movies, even this new Superman movie handles it very well. Here she just doesn't have that edge, and I wish that Lois had that edge to not only bounce off of Superman well, but also Clark Kent, because Clark Kent is even more naive and childish, at least how Christopher Reeve portrayed him. And this movie does try to keep that continuous, and I guess it's time to talk about the real star of this movie, and that is Brandon Routh as Superman. And it's kind of a mixed bag. I see what they're going for. They clearly cast Brandon Routh because he looks a lot like Chris Reeve. Even though he looks a little too young for this to be 5 years after Superman 2, he actually looks younger than Chris Reeve looks in Superman 2, so that doesn't quite work, but that's really splitting hairs. And if you want a really good Chris Reeve impression that Brandon Routh gives, look at the CW crossover event Crisis on Infinite Earths, where he was able to reprise this role, and he does a much better job. He nails it. And I would have loved to see this actor be given a TV show or a movie franchise to really explore that performance, because here, not only is he slightly too young, and yeah, that's a nitpick, he's also not really written all that well. When he's in the Clark Kent persona, he doesn't really have that Clark Kent bumbling doofus, almost cartoony attitude that Christopher Reeve had that this movie is clearly trying to harken back to. Brandon Routh just seems a lot more subdued and a lot more low energy. Maybe part of that is because he is this kind of fish out of water all of a sudden, going back to Daily Planet, and he's realizing that because he left, everything's kind of fallen apart, and Lois Lane is married, so his chances with her romantically have kind of disappeared. And on top of that, Lex Luthor's out of prison, so he does have a lot weighing on his shoulders. But I think the biggest misstep with regards to Routh's performance is that he doesn't have a big enough contrast between his Clark Kent and his Superman persona. The Superman persona is more or less an extension of the farm boy from Kansas persona that his Clark Kent is. It just feels a little muddy in this movie. Almost like they didn't really know how to play Clark Kent. Superman feels more or less like you would remember from the Christopher Reeve performance. He's truth, justice, the American way, a bit naive, a bit of a Boy Scout, which is what you'd expect, although they do have some strange choices, like having him stalk Lois Lane with his X-ray vision. That has not aged particularly well. I doubt that was even well received at the time. But Superman, I don't know, just feels kind of low energy. And I guess that's a good word to describe this whole movie. It's a surprisingly low energy movie. And on top of that, it's long. It's a little over 2.5 hours, which for a Superman movie is on the longer side. And I'm not saying a Superman movie can't be good and be 2.5 hours, but I feel like there's a lot of wasted time here. There's a lot of cases here in the editing where we start scenes way too early and end scenes way too late. They could have easily trimmed 20-30 minutes off of this movie. There's a lot of dead air and lines that I'm sure seemed funny when they were being written and just don't come across as all that memorable or clever on screen. Although there is one actor and performance in this movie that is definitely not low energy, and that is Kevin Spacey as Lex Luthor. And I think Kevin Spacey as Lex Luthor is interesting because even though he's supposed to be a continuation of Gene Hackman's Lex Luthor, he's not really. The performance is very different, and it's very Kevin Spacey. He has that dry sarcasm that you'd expect, and he actually is not a bad Lex Luthor on his own terms. It's actually probably the closest we've gotten to the post-crisis billionaire stoic Lex Luthor that we know from Superman the Animated Series, which is probably my favorite incarnation of Lex Luthor, period. He's this very cold, calculating, brilliant businessman. And I do get elements of that from Kevin Spacey. He's the one live action Lex Luthor that I've seen that I 100% believe can either outsmart or outtalk Superman. He's actually a pretty formidable threat in this movie, and among all of the Superman movies, he has, by a pretty wide margin, gotten the closest to actually killing the Man of Steel. And that's because his big plan in this movie is, yeah, a bit of a retread of Gene Hackman's plan in the first movie. He wants land. But here he's actually going about it in a creative way. He steals a crystal from Superman's Fortress of Solitude, wraps it up in kryptonite, and launches it into the sea to create his own island made of a combination of crystal and kryptonite. And I think that's actually a pretty original idea. There is potential with this setup of Superman needing to fight or confront Lex Luthor on this island where his powers are negated. And more so than that, the longer he stays on this island, the more it is killing him, which definitely levels the playing field physically, where I think Lex could actually beat up Superman and potentially kill him. And we do see that a little bit. And I know I'm kind of skipping over a lot. I'm just going straight to the third act. But all the stuff leading up to that really doesn't amount to much. What do we have? Well, we have a lot of dry talking scenes that just aren't that interesting about Superman and Clark Kent acclimating back to Metropolis after being away, and all these reactions shots of, oh, that wasn't how I remember it when I left it, and just a lot of moping around, wasting our time. And when the Superman action does go down, there are some admittedly exciting action scenes, like the first one that we see, which I think actually holds up fairly well. It's the plane scene where the shuttle's trying to launch off of the back of this plane, but it's not working, so Superman needs to detach it, and then the plane starts crashing, so Superman needs to find a way to set this plane down very gently on a baseball diamond. It's a pretty fun action scene, and you do get to see Superman use different problem solving to fix these little mini disasters while he's trying to keep this plane from crashing to the earth. So that one's handled pretty well, but then you realize pretty quickly that every time Superman needs to save the day, he saves the day in the exact same way every time. It's always him needing to lift or catch something very heavy. And like I said, the first time you see this with the plane crash, it looks really cool. Then you see it again with the globe of the Daily Planet falling, and he needs to catch that, and it looks like Atlas, and I see what you did there. But then you see it again with him stopping this runaway car with the brakes cut, and he holds it in the same way that he held the car in the first issue of Superman, and now I see what you did there again. But now it's starting to feel a bit repetitive, and it just keeps going on. They just keep finding new and bigger things for him to lift. He lifts up half of Lex Luthor's yacht as it's sinking. He lifts bursts up a seaplane to let it fly off so it can have a clear course to Metropolis. And then in the climax, he has to lift the whole island out of the water. And yeah, while these things are getting bigger and a bit more impressive, it's still just him lifting something big. I would have liked to see him maybe throw a punch or use his heat vision. And while he does use that a couple different times, it's not all that memorable. It's kind of in the background. They don't really find many creative uses for it. It's just in the obvious ways that would first come to your mind. So yeah, I'm a little disappointed because even in 2006, we had the technology to do a lot more exciting action scenes than just him lifting heavy things, especially when he gets to this kryptonite island. And the first time I saw this movie, I was like, okay, here it's gonna go down. Superman and Lex Luthor. Superman's on the defense because of all the kryptonite around, and Lex is the upper hand. How's this gonna go? And again, it just doesn't go anywhere exciting. Lex just hits him and he immediately falls to the ground, and they just start kicking him while he's down, beating up on him. And then Lex takes a little pointy piece of kryptonite and stabs him with it, breaks it off inside, and just kind of leaves him to die. And aside from the little kryptonite dagger that he has, which is admittedly a little creative and a unique way to use kryptonite as a weapon that we haven't seen in live action before, the rest of this scene is just so lifeless. Superman doesn't even get up off of the ground. He doesn't bite. He doesn't throw a punch. He doesn't do anything Superman worthy. He just kind of rolls over and takes it, which is just not what you want out of a Superman movie. Because sure, this is the part of the movie where he loses, and we all know that he has to lose before he can dig deep and then win in the end. So obviously the scene needs to play out more or less the way it plays out, but there are 100 different things you could do to make this more exciting, make Superman's last stand. I would have loved to see this Superman and this Lex Luthor just come to blows with each other, because we haven't seen that in any of the other movies, because if they did, Superman would just punch Lex one time and his head would come off. Here they're on a bit more of a level playing field, and Kevin Spacey is a bit more physically fit and physically intimidating than Gene Hackman was, so I feel like you could have gotten a pretty raw, bare-knuckle fight between the two of them. That would have been great, but unfortunately we don't. They can start lifting the whole island out of the ocean before its growth and spread reaches Metropolis, and in a very slow and drawn out way, you see him starting to lift it, bring it into orbit, and then just launch it into space. And maybe launch is a bit too exciting a word to describe what's going on. He very slowly tosses it and lets it float away into space. And maybe Bryan Singer was trying to do something here with the opening of the movie being him trying to find a fragment of Krypton and finding ultimately nothing out there, and now there's something that's basically a miniature Krypton growing on Earth, and he has to send it out into space. Maybe there was an idea there of him needing to let go or reject Krypton, but I feel like I'm reaching, because at no point has anybody discussed that. At no point does that come up in any of their conversations, any of the dialogue. Even in the scenes between Superman and his Earth mom, when they're actually talking about what he did when he went out there, we're not really given any new insight or information or how Superman feels about the whole thing. It's all very minimal, bare bones stuff, almost like the writer or director or somebody didn't even want to explore that aspect of Superman, and instead just gave us this empty husk of the movie. And then the movie just drags on for another, I don't know, 20 minutes, 15 minutes. It feels like another 30 minutes after he launches this thing into space, because everything after that point is slow. He slowly crashes down to Earth. He slowly goes into the hospital, and they're trying to take out the kryptonite, and they're trying to get him back to health. And then he slowly recovers. He's in a coma for a bit, and then he wakes up, and then he has a conversation with Lois, and he meets his son, because yes, that is actually Superman's son, which we see evidence of one time in this movie when he chucks a piano at a bad guy, which at that point, it kind of snapped me out of this daze I was in, because for a long time in this movie, just nothing remotely interesting is happening. And then Super Kid launches this piano at a bad guy, killing him, and you're like, oh, okay, so there's a Super Kid now, and okay, maybe there's something interesting we can do with that. Maybe he can start flying and start unlocking more powers. Maybe Lois doesn't know how to handle that. Now they bring in this love triangle again between Superman, her husband played by James Marsden, who's just totally forgettable and wasted in this movie, and he just kind of plays the generic third wheel in the Superman-Lois dynamic. But maybe now that this Super Kid has been outed as having superpowers, they could involve him, and there'd be some interesting character dilemmas of what to do with him, how to raise him, who's his father. No, they don't really come up in this movie. Those ideas are introduced and then just never followed up on, never really addressed. Superman says he's always going to be around, but very vague as to what that means, and the movie just kind of ends with this very empty feeling of what did we just do for the past 2.5 hours? We saw Superman in the costume flying around lifting heavy things that seem to have no real consequence, and then when he's Clark Kent, he's just kind of mopey. So on both levels, the Superman stuff is isn't that interesting, and the Daily Planet Clark Kent stuff isn't that interesting. It's just kind of a nothing movie where, aside from a legitimately entertaining Kevin Spacey performance as Lex Luthor, arguably one of the best Lex Luthors we've ever had, this movie just doesn't offer much that's interesting to enjoy. And top of that, it's not even that colorful. If they really wanted to harken back to the Christopher Reeve days, they would have brightened up the suit, brightened up the red. It's this muted burgundy look for the cape and the S and the boots. It all looks so washed out and muted. Brighten it up with some color, make the Daily Planet look colorful like it's right out of a comic book. Really lean into that 78 Superman camp, because that movie was bright and colorful, unabashedly so. It looks fantastic. This movie just seems so washed out. Metropolis is just washed out in this muted sepia tone color. Superman's costume looks muted. The island isn't even a bright, sparkly crystal green. It's this dark, dirty, muted green that just honestly looks ugly, and not even intentionally so. It just looks kind of like lazy production design. And I guess those are all my thoughts on Superman Returns. It was kind of disappointing looking back. I was really hoping that I'd find more things to like about this movie, because I do love those first two movies, and I like Brandon Routh as Superman in theory. Again, in the CW Arrowverse, when he was able to do that performance, he did it a million times better. But looking back at this movie, there's just not much here. There's a couple of cool moments, maybe a few interesting shots. Like one that I can't believe I forgot to talk about, when Superman goes against that minigun and it's bouncing bullets off of his chest. That of course looks neat, but we've seen that before. But the one shot in that sequence that we haven't seen before and that everybody remembers is when he takes a bullet to the eye and it just crumples right in front of him. That's a pretty cool shot. And there are a handful of shots like that in here that do wake me up a little bit out of this daze, but that's just not most of this movie. I wish there were more moments like that in here, but there just aren't. And now I turn over to you guys. What do you think about Superman Returns? Whatever you think, let me know in the comments. And if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content, and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. And as always, I'm Colby. This is my Nerdy Talk, and I'll see you in the next video.